Not all cars are created equal. Some dominate the road, while others, well, they become the punchline of a bad joke. You'd think major car brands wouldn't mess up, but these 40 cars prove that even the biggest names can make massive blunders. We're talking about cars so unreliable, they spend more time in the shop than on the road, models that were doomed from the start, and design choices so questionable, they make you wonder what the engineers were thinking. So, if you're in the market for a new ride, consider this your ultimate do not buy list. Stick around, because some of these disasters might just surprise you. Starting at number 40, we have Mitsubishi Mirage. The Mitsubishi Mirage is proof that just because a car is cheap doesn't mean it's a good deal. When people hear affordable, they might think good value, but in this case, it's more like you get what you pay for, and not much more. Under the hood, the Mirage sports a 1.2-liter three-cylinder engine producing a laughable 78 horsepower. That means highway merging feels like a life-or-death scenario, and forget about overtaking anyone unless you have a mile-long stretch of open road. The CVT transmission only makes things worse, droning loudly while struggling to deliver any sort of power. Step inside, and you'll be greeted by hard plastic everywhere, seats that feel as comfortable as a lawn chair, and a bare-bones infotainment system that looks straight out of 2010. Yes, it's fuel efficient, and yes, it's one of the cheapest new cars you can buy, but at what cost? When a used Honda Civic offers better performance, comfort, and reliability for the same price, it's hard to justify buying a Mirage. And speaking of cars that make questionable design choices, the next one is a stretched-out version of a once-beloved small car. But unfortunately, more size didn't mean more success. At number 39, we see Fiat 500L. The Fiat 500 is known for its cute retro styling and fun city driving experience. But when Fiat decided to stretch it into a larger, more practical family car, they somehow created one of the most awkward and disappointing vehicles on the market, the Fiat 500L. The problem? It looked weirdly proportioned, like a Fiat 500 that was awkwardly elongated. Instead of maintaining the charm of the original, the 500L ended up looking like a minivan that wasn't sure of its own identity. And while it was marketed as a practical choice, it had one major issue: terrible reliability. Under the hood, the 1.4-liter turbocharged engine with 160 horsepower was supposed to be peppy, but it was let down by an awful automatic transmission that felt sluggish and unresponsive. Owners frequently reported electrical problems, transmission failures, and a glitchy infotainment system. The driving experience was neither fun nor smooth, making it a car that no one really enjoyed driving. Fiat eventually pulled the plug on the 500L due to poor sales, proving that bigger isn't always better. But if you think this was a questionable attempt at a city car, the next one takes impracticality to a whole new level. Coming in at number 38 is Smart for Two. If you thought small cars were practical, the Smart for Two was here to challenge that assumption. On paper, it was a great idea, a tiny, fuel-efficient city car that could park almost anywhere. In reality, it was an overpriced, impractical, and ununderwhelming vehicle that nobody really wanted. Let's start with the performance, or lack thereof. The 1.0-liter three-cylinder engine making 89 horsepower struggled with acceleration, and the automated manual transmission was jerky and unpredictable. Driving it felt less like a smooth ride and more like a continuous guessing game of whether the gear shifts would be decent or completely awful. The interior wasn't much better. While it had a quirky design, it lacked proper storage space, and the tiny trunk could barely fit a couple of grocery bags. The worst part? Despite being so small, it didn't even get amazing fuel economy compared to larger, more powerful subcompacts like the Honda Fit or Toyota Yaris. People eventually realized that for the same money, they could get a bigger, more capable car with better reliability. And if reliability is what you're after, the next SUV is definitely one to avoid. Number 37 goes to Land Rover Discovery Sport. When people hear Land Rover, they think of luxury and off-road capability. Unfortunately, the Land Rover Discovery Sport is famous for something else entirely, constantly breaking down. On the surface, it looks great. It has premium styling, a plush interior, and the Land Rover badge that gives it an air of prestige. But underneath, it's plagued with poor reliability, frequent electrical issues, and an infotainment system that's so buggy, it might as well be running on dial-up. The 2.0-liter turbocharged engine isn't particularly powerful for the weight of the vehicle, making acceleration sluggish. The automatic transmission doesn't help either, often feeling unresponsive and hesitant. And when something goes wrong, and it will, you're looking at hefty repair bills that make you question why you didn't just buy a Toyota Highlander instead. If you're someone who enjoys the thrill of uncertainty every time you turn the key, then maybe the Discovery Sport is for you. Otherwise, you'll probably want to steer clear, just like Acura drivers did with their next big failure. Taking the 36th spot is Acura ZDX. If you've never heard of the Acura ZDX, don't worry, you're not alone. Acura tried to introduce a sleek coupe-like crossover, but instead, they ended up with a vehicle that looked like a science experiment gone wrong. The ZDX was supposed to be sporty and luxurious, but its sloped roofline completely killed its practicality. Rear passengers suffered from terrible headroom, and the cargo space was significantly reduced compared to other SUVs in its class. It was neither a proper SUV nor a true coupe. It was just an odd, expensive in-between. Performance-wise, the ZDX had a 3.7-liter V6 producing 300 horsepower, so it wasn't slow. But it was still heavier and clumsier than a proper sports car, and Acura's pricing strategy made it worse. For the same price, buyers could get a BMW X6 or a Porsche Cayenne, both of which offered better performance and prestige. Sales were abysmal, and Acura quickly pulled the ZDX from the lineup. It remains a forgotten relic of a time when automakers thought every car needed to be a crossover, even when it didn't make sense. At number 35, we find Chrysler 200. If there was ever a car that perfectly defined the word meh, it was the Chrysler 200. Chrysler tried to make it a stylish, mid-sized sedan that could compete with the Honda Accord and Toyota Camry, but instead, they created a car that was forgettable, uncomfortable, and plagued with problems. Let's start with the design. It wasn't ugly, but it wasn't particularly exciting either. The interior was cramped, especially in the rear seats, where passengers felt like they were sitting in a shoebox. The 9-speed automatic transmission was clunky and slow, and the infotainment system often froze or lagged. But the biggest issue? Reliability. Chrysler eventually realized the 200 was a lost cause and discontinued it in 2017, proving that not every sedan needs to exist. And speaking of unnecessary cars, our next one is a truck that somehow managed to disappoint both pickup fans and SUV lovers at the same time. Holding the 34th position is Honda Ridgeline, first generation. Honda is known for reliable, practical vehicles, but when they tried to build a pickup truck, things didn't go as planned. The first-generation Honda Ridgeline was supposed to be a unique take on the truck formula, but instead, it just confused buyers. For one, it didn't even have a proper body-on-frame construction like traditional trucks. Instead, it used a unibody design which made it less capable for heavy-duty work. Sure, it had a cool-in-bed trunk, but truck buyers didn't care. They wanted towing capacity, ruggedness, and a real truck feel. Performance-wise, it had a 3.5-liter V6 making 250 horsepower, which wasn't bad, but the all-wheel drive system wasn't built for serious off-roading, and the bed was too small for real truck duties. Ultimately, traditional truck owners stuck with their Ford F-150s and Chevy Silverados, while non-truck owners never saw a reason to buy one. Honda fixed a lot of these issues in later models, but the first-gen Ridgeline remains a failed experiment. And if you thought Honda had misfires, wait until you hear about Cadillac's attempt at making a luxury hybrid. Ranked at number 33 is Cadillac ELR. The Cadillac ELR was essentially a Chevy Volt in a fancy suit, but there was one major problem. It cost over $75,000. Cadillac wanted to enter the hybrid luxury market with something sleek and stylish, and to be fair, the ELR looked amazing. The issue? Under the hood, it had the same 1.4-liter gasoline engine and electric motor as the Chevy Volt, but with a higher price tag and worse performance. The 0 to 60 miles per hour time was nearly 9 seconds, making it slower than most economy cars. And the electric range of 37 miles was nothing groundbreaking. People quickly realized that for half the price, they could get a fully loaded Volt with nearly identical capabilities. Sales were horrendous, and Cadillac pulled the plug on the ELR after just a couple of years. But if you think overpricing a hybrid was bad, the next car proves that even legendary sports car brands can make massive mistakes. In the 32nd place, we have Maserati Ghibli. When you hear Maserati, you probably think of exotic Italian luxury and roaring V8s. But the Maserati Ghibli was marketed as a more affordable entry-level model, which unfortunately meant cut corners, poor reliability, and a hefty repair bill. First off, it wasn't even that affordable. Prices started at around $75,000, putting it in the same range as a BMW 5 Series or Mercedes E-Class. But while those cars offered smooth, refined performance, the Ghibli came with cheap interior materials, a Chrysler-based infotainment system, and a stiff, unrefined ride. The 3-liter twin-turbo V6 sounded good, but the automatic transmission was jerky, and the car wasn't as fast as it looked. The worst part? Maserati's infamous reliability issues. Despite its Italian flair, the Ghibli was more of a wallet-draining disappointment than a true luxury contender. And speaking of overpriced disasters, our final car somehow made minivans even less appealing. Occupying the 31st spot is Nissan Quest Final Generation. Minivans aren't known for being exciting, but the Nissan Quest somehow managed to be one of the worst in its class. While competitors like the Honda Odyssey and Toyota Sienna continued evolving with better features, safety, and practicality, the Quest felt like Nissan simply stopped trying. For starters, it had a weird, boxy design that wasn't as sleek or modern as its rivals. The infotainment system was outdated, and while it had decent interior space, it lacked the smart storage solutions that other minivans offered. Then there was the biggest issue, its CVT transmission. Nissan's continuously variable transmission was notoriously unreliable, leading to frequent breakdowns and expensive repairs. Many owners found themselves spending thousands on transmission replacements, making the Quest a financial headache. Eventually, Nissan saw the writing on the wall and discontinued the Quest in 2017. And with that, this uninspired minivan became yet another example of why some cars simply shouldn't exist. At number 30, we have Dodge Dart, 2013 to 2016. The Dodge Dart was meant to bring the brand back into the compact sedan market with a mix of sportiness and affordability. Unfortunately, it failed spectacularly. Dodge based the Dart on a modified Alfa Romeo Giulietta platform, which should have given it some European flair. Instead, it inherited the worst aspects of both brands: unreliable mechanics and underwhelming performance. The base 2.0-liter Tiger Shark engine made a mere 160 horsepower, which wasn't enough to compete with the Honda Civic or Mazda 3. Inside, the Dart was plagued with quality issues. The interior felt cheap, the infotainment system lagged, and the seats lacked support. Reliability was another disaster. Owners reported electrical failures, stalling engines, and faulty transmissions. Dodge tried marketing it as a sportier alternative, but even the Dart GT with a 6-speed manual wasn't engaging enough to win over enthusiasts. By 2016, Dodge pulled the plug due to terrible sales. Today, you can find Darts for under $5,000, but unless you enjoy engine warning lights, it's best to avoid them. Speaking of budget-friendly disasters, let's talk about a car that's somehow become a joke. Coming in at number 29 is Chevy Malibu, 9th generation, 2016 present. This car was once a respected mid-size sedan that has faded into mediocrity. Its base 1.5-liter turbocharged engine, making just 163 horsepower, struggles to compete with rivals like the Honda Accord and Toyota Camry, while the CVT transmission further dulls performance with sluggish acceleration. Inside, the Malibu's cabin feels outdated, relying on cheap plastics and lacking the refinement seen in competitors. The driving experience is equally uninspiring, with numb steering and an overall lack of excitement. As the mid-size sedan market shrinks, brands like Toyota and Honda have evolved their models to stay competitive, but the Malibu simply exists without excelling in any key area. With the discontinuation of the hybrid version and the growing dominance of SUVs and EVs, the Malibu seems destined to disappear soon. Another example of a nameplate that has lost its former edge. The fact that Chevy tried to sell this car is hilarious. But if you thought this was bad, just wait until we talk about Jeep's biggest embarrassment. Holding the 28th spot is Jeep Compass, 2007 to 2016. When Jeep unveiled the Compass, off-road enthusiasts expected a rugged, small SUV. Instead, they got a glorified Dodge Caliber with none of the Jeep DNA. The first-gen Compass was built on a front-wheel drive platform. Yes, a Jeep that couldn't even handle dirt roads properly. Even when AWD models were available, the off-road capability was laughable. Forget rock climbing, this thing could barely handle a gravel driveway. Under the hood, the base 2.0-liter engine made a weak 158 horsepower, while the 2.4-liter barely improved that with 172 horsepower. Worse yet, Jeep saddled it with one of the worst CVT transmissions ever made. Owners complained about sluggish acceleration, rubber band-like power delivery, and premature failures. The interior? Plasticky, cheap, and uninspired. The seats were uncomfortable, road noise was excessive, and the infotainment system was embarrassingly outdated. Despite its horrible reputation, the Compass sold decently because it was cheap. But Jeep eventually realized their mistake and overhauled the Compass in 2017. Still, first-gen Compass models are some of the least desirable SUVs on the used market today. But if you thought Jeep made mistakes, Nissan outdid them with this bizarre misfire. At number 27, we find Nissan Juke 2011 to 2017. The Nissan Juke is one of those cars that makes you question automotive design choices. Who looked at this and said, yes, this is what the people want? The Juke was powered by a 1.6-liter turbocharged four-cylinder, making 188 horsepower, which sounds decent. Then there's the interior. The Juke's rear seats were cramped, cargo space was minimal, and visibility was awful. The tiny rear window and thick pillars made it feel like you were driving inside a cave. To make things worse, Nissan's CVT transmissions are known for early failures. Many Juke owners reported transmission issues as early as 40,000 miles. Despite its quirks, some people loved the Juke's weird personality, but the majority? They avoided it. Nissan finally discontinued the Juke in 2017, replacing it with the far more sensible Kicks. But if you thought Nissan made weird design choices, let's talk about Chrysler's biggest misstep. Taking the 26th position is Chrysler PT Cruiser 2000 to 2010. The PT Cruiser was a short-lived icon that aged like expired milk. Chrysler wanted to capitalize on the retro car craze, but instead they made a slow, ugly, and unreliable compact car. Under the hood, the base 2.4-liter engine made just 150 horsepower, which made the PT Cruiser painfully slow. The 4-speed automatic transmission was sluggish, and handling was atrocious. Inside, the cheap plastic interior didn't match its retro styling. Reliability was a nightmare, with owners experiencing frequent overheating, engine failures, and electrical problems. By the late 2000s, the PT Cruiser became a joke in the car world. Chrysler finally killed it in 2010, and today, most surviving models look like they've been through a war. And speaking of weird cars, let's move on to a Honda nobody asked for. At number 25, we have Honda Cross Tour 2010 to 2015. The Honda Cross Tour was Honda's attempt at blending a sedan with an SUV. The problem? Nobody wanted that. Based on the Honda Accord, the Cross Tour featured a fastback design that severely limited cargo space. Honda claimed it was a more sporty crossover alternative, but in reality, it was heavier and less practical than both the Accord and the CR-V. The base 2.4-liter engine and 192 horsepower was underpowered for its weight, and even the 3.5-liter V6 providing 278 horsepower felt sluggish due to the car's bulky design. Sales were so bad that Honda pulled the plug in 2015. Today, you'll rarely see one, because most people didn't even know it existed. Coming in at number 24 is Cadillac Cimarron, 1982 to 1988. If you ever need a textbook example of badge engineering gone wrong, look no further than the Cadillac Cimarron. This car is a legendary disaster, proving that you can't just slap a luxury badge on a cheap car and expect people to fall for it. In the early 1980s, Cadillac was under pressure to compete with rising European luxury brands like BMW and Mercedes-Benz. Instead of developing a new, high-quality luxury sedan, General Motors took a Chevrolet Cavalier, slightly dressed it up, and called it the Cimarron. Yes, this so-called Cadillac was literally just a rebadged economy car, and people immediately saw through it. Under the hood, the base 2-liter 4-cylinder engine made a laughable 88 horsepower, meaning this luxury car had the same power as an economy hatchback. Later models introduced a 2.8-liter V6 pushing out 130 horsepower, but by then, the damage was already done. The Cimarron was slow, uninspiring, and embarrassing to drive. Inside, Cadillac tried to mask the cheapness with leather seats and a fancier dashboard, but nothing could hide the cheap plastics, tiny size, and lack of features. Even worse, the price tag was insanely high, putting it in the same league as actual luxury cars. Critics ripped the Cimarron apart and customers refused to buy it. Cadillac quickly realized their mistake, but it took 6 years before they finally killed it in 1988. Number 23 goes to Pontiac Aztek, 2001 to 2005. You knew this one was coming. The Pontiac Aztek is legendary for all the wrong reasons. While technically an SUV, its minivan-like platform and awkward styling made it an outcast. The design? A disaster. It looked like GM let different teams design separate parts without ever meeting. Chunky body cladding, bizarre proportions, and a front end that looked melted didn't help. Performance was just as underwhelming. The 3.4-liter V6 made 185 horsepower felt sluggish, and the outdated 4-speed automatic didn't do it any favors. Inside, Pontiac tried to be innovative with a removable cooler and a camping package, but cheap plastics and poor build quality ruined the experience. Sales flopped, and Pontiac axed it after 4 years. Ironically, it found fame as Walter White's car in Breaking Bad, but back in the day, no one wanted to be caught driving one. Bold idea, terrible execution. If the Aztek was a case of bold ideas executed poorly, the Dodge Aspen was the opposite, a traditional sedan that should have been solid but failed due to quality issues. Taking the 27th place is Dodge Aspen, 1976 to 1980. At first, the Dodge Aspen seemed like a solid mid-size sedan, comfortable, available with a V8, and positioned as an affordable alternative to bigger cars. But then, reality set in. This thing was a rust magnet, with some models developing holes within a few years. Quality control was horrendous. Doors wouldn't shut properly, transmissions failed early, and suspension issues were common. Then there were the recalls, over 1 million of them, making the Aspen one of the most recalled cars of its time. Even though Chrysler tried to fix it, the damage was done. Sure, you could get a V8, but what's the point if your car is falling apart before it even hits 50,000 miles? The Aspen's legacy is one of disappointment, and by 1980, it was replaced by the Dodge Diplomat. Today, it's mostly remembered as a cautionary tale of how bad quality control can ruin a promising car. While the Aspen suffered from rust and recalls, the Sterling 825 faced a different problem: British engineering that simply couldn't compete with Japanese reliability. At number 21, we see Sterling 825, 1987 to 1991. The Sterling 825 is one of the most forgettable luxury cars ever sold in America. Built by British automaker Rover, but based on the excellent Acura Legend, it should have been a hit. Instead, it was a disaster. While the Honda Source 2.5-liter V6 was solid, everything else fell apart. The electronics were a nightmare. Interior trim pieces fell off, and the car developed rattles faster than a child's toy collection. Even though it offered leather seats and wood trim, the poor build quality made it feel cheap. Buyers quickly realized that for the same money, they could get an Acura Legend, which was actually reliable. Sales plummeted, and by 1991, Sterling completely abandoned the US market. Today, the 825 is nothing more than a relic of failed British engineering. If you somehow find one on the road, consider it an automotive unicorn, one that probably barely runs. Speaking of luxury failures, Lincoln's Versailles proves that even American brands struggled with rebadged, uninspired designs. Holding the 20th spot is Lincoln Versailles, 1977 to 1980. Lincoln tried to compete with Cadillac Seville, but ended up creating one of the laziest rebadges in history. Instead of designing a new luxury sedan, Ford took a Mercury Monarch, added a fancier grille, some wood trim, and an inflated price tag. The result? A small, uninspiring luxury car that no one wanted. Power came from a 5-liter V8, but it only made 133 horsepower, not exactly thrilling for a luxury vehicle. Meanwhile, the ride quality wasn't particularly smooth, and the back seat was cramped. Buyers weren't fooled, and sales were embarrassing. Lincoln pulled the plug on the Versailles after just a few years, admitting defeat. Today, it's mostly remembered as an example of how not to compete in the luxury market. While Cadillac's Seville went on to success, the Versailles faded into obscurity. If the Versailles was a case of a bad luxury rebadge, the mid-2000s Zephyr was a lesson in how to make a mid-size sedan as bland as possible. Ranked at number 19 is Lincoln Zephyr 2006, MKZ 2007 to 2012 early years. The Lincoln Zephyr had a sleek name, but not much else. It was essentially a dressed-up Ford Fusion with a higher price tag and a fancier grille. Lincoln quickly rebranded it as the MKZ in 2007, but the early versions weren't much better. Performance was adequate, with a 3-liter V6 making 221 horsepower, but it didn't feel luxurious or special. The ride was soft, the handling was uninspiring, and the interior was filled with Ford-grade materials. Buyers looking for a real luxury experience went with Lexus, BMW, or Cadillac instead. Lincoln eventually improved the MKZ, but the early years were forgettable. Today, the Zephyr MKZ from this era is mostly remembered as a half-hearted attempt at luxury, a car that never quite justified its premium badge. And if you thought the Zephyr lacked personality, Chrysler's Sebring took mediocrity to an entirely new level. In the 18th position, we have Chrysler Sebring 2007-10. The 2007-2010 Chrysler Sebring was an embarrassment. Its design was awkward, with weird proportions and a front grille that looked oversized and clumsy. But the real disappointment was inside. Step into the cabin, and you'd be greeted with some of the cheapest, hard plastics Chrysler ever put in a car. It felt more like a budget rental than a competitive midsize sedan. The driving experience wasn't any better. The base 2.4-liter four-cylinder was sluggish, and even the optional V6 felt underwhelming. Reliability was another disaster, with reports of transmission failures, electrical gremlins, and suspension issues. The Sebring became a joke, known for being dumped into rental fleets rather than bought by real customers. Chrysler eventually tried to salvage its reputation with the 200, but by then, the damage was done. Today, the Sebring is remembered as one of the worst mid-size sedans of its era. But Chrysler wasn't the only one struggling to make a compelling midsize sedan. Suzuki's Verona tried and failed just as hard. At number 17, we find Suzuki Verona 2004 to 2006. Suzuki's attempt to take on the Toyota Camry and Honda Accord ended in failure with the Verona. It was supposed to be a budget luxury sedan, but it barely felt like an economy car. On paper, the 2.5-liter inline-six engine sounded decent, until you realized it only made 155 horsepower and was paired with a sluggish 4-speed automatic. That meant sluggish acceleration and poor fuel economy. The handling was uninspired, the interior was full of cheap materials, and reliability was awful. Suzuki's small dealership network didn't help either. The Verona was such a flop that it lasted only 3 years before Suzuki pulled the plug. Today, it's nearly extinct and no one misses it. Both Suzuki and Hyundai aimed for affordable luxury, but the XG350 proved Hyundai still had work to do before becoming a true premium brand. Occupying the 16th place is Hyundai XG350, 2002 to 2005. Before Hyundai found success with the Genesis, they made the XG350, an awkward attempt at a luxury sedan that missed the mark. The 3.5-liter V6 made 194 horsepower, which wasn't bad, but the driving experience was dull. The suspension was too soft, and the steering had no road feel. Hyundai tried to make the interior upscale with fake wood trim and leather seats, but the overall build quality was lacking. Worst of all, Hyundai's reliability was still a question mark back then. Many XG350s suffered from transmission and electrical problems, hurting its reputation further. Hyundai eventually replaced it with the Azera, which was a step up, but by then, no one cared. The XG350 remains a forgotten chapter in Hyundai's history. Meanwhile, Mitsubishi, once a serious competitor, let the Galant stagnate into irrelevance. Taking the 15th spot is Mitsubishi Galant 2004-2012. Mitsubishi once had a respectable mid-sized sedan with the Galant, but by the mid-2000s, it was clear the company had given up. While competitors like the Honda Accord and Toyota Camry kept improving, the Galant felt stuck in the past. The base 4-cylinder was underpowered, and even the available V6 wasn't particularly exciting. The interior was full of hard plastics, the ride was forgettable, and Mitsubishi's dealership network was shrinking fast. With minimal updates and no real effort to compete, the Galant quickly became irrelevant. By 2012, Mitsubishi finally pulled the plug on it, and hardly anyone noticed. Today, finding one is rare, not because they're valuable, but because most owners traded them in for something, anything better. If the Galant felt outdated, the Daewoo Leganza proved that sometimes a car is doomed before it even arrives. At number 14, we have Daewoo Leganza, 1999 to 2002. Daewoo tried to break into the American market with the Leganza, but things didn't go as planned. On paper, it had a 2.2-liter four-cylinder making 131 horsepower, not impressive but acceptable for the time. The problem? Everything else. The build quality was laughable, with cheap plastic interiors that felt like they'd crack under a stiff breeze. The suspension was soft, making every pothole feel like an earthquake, and handling was non-existent. Then, there was reliability, or the lack of it. Owners dealt with electrical failures, overheating engines, and poor durability. To make matters worse, Daewoo went bankrupt, leaving customers stranded without dealer support. If you ever spot a Leganza on the road today, it's a rare sight, not because they were great, but because they didn't last. Daewoo failed due to poor build quality and lack of brand recognition, but GM's Corsica showed that even established brands could make forgettable cars. Coming in at number 13 is Chevrolet Corsica, 1987 to 1996. The Chevrolet Corsica is the definition of cheap and forgettable. It was GM's attempt at a budget-friendly midsize sedan, but it had all the excitement of a government fleet vehicle. The design was bland, the interior was uninspired, and the base four-cylinder engine felt weak. Reliability was another issue, with electrical gremlins and transmission problems being common. Despite its shortcomings, GM managed to sell plenty of these cars, mostly to rental fleets and cost-conscious buyers. But by the time the Corsica was replaced by the Malibu, nobody was sad to see it go. Today, it's mostly a memory, a car that existed, but left no lasting impression. Speaking of uninspired sedans, Dodge's Dynasty tried to bring old-school comfort to a market that had already moved on. Holding the 12th spot is Dodge Dynasty, 1988 to 1993. The Dodge Dynasty had a name that suggested something grand, but the reality was far less exciting. Built to appeal to an older crowd, its boxy styling and plush suspension made it feel outdated from the start. Under the hood, you had a choice of underwhelming engines, including a 2.5-liter four-cylinder that struggled to move this hefty sedan. The interior was bland, and the driving experience was uninspired. Dodge made the Dynasty cheap and comfortable, but it lacked personality and innovation. As Dodge shifted toward its more modern LH platform sedans, the Dynasty faded into obscurity. Today, it's a relic of the late 80s, a car that was never truly bad, but never really good either. And if you think the Dynasty was dull, the Ford Tempo took that concept and ran with it, slowly. At number 11, we see Ford Tempo. 1984 to 1994, the Ford Tempo was supposed to be a fuel-efficient, front-wheel drive alternative to older sedans, but it ended up as a symbol of mediocrity. The base 2.3-liter four-cylinder made a miserable 90 horsepower, making highway merging a test of patience. The styling wasn't offensive, just utterly forgettable. And then there was the handling. If you liked body roll and vague steering, the Tempo was your dream car. Ford sold a lot of Tempos, but mostly to budget-conscious buyers who wanted basic transportation. By the mid-90s, the competition had moved on, leaving the Tempo feeling hopelessly outdated. Today, the Tempo is barely remembered, and that's probably for the best. But at least the Tempo didn't have a weird, off-putting design, something Buick Skylark couldn't avoid. Breaking into the top 10, at number 10, we have Buick Skylark, 1992 to 1998. Buick tried to give the Skylark a bold wedge-shaped design, but instead, it just looked odd. The styling wasn't its only problem. Under the hood, the base 2.3-liter quad-4 engine was noisy and unrefined, making every drive feel rough. Even the optional V6 didn't add much excitement. Inside, things weren't much better. The dashboard had a strange, asymmetric design that felt unnatural, and the interior materials were disappointingly cheap for a Buick. The driving experience? Completely forgettable. By the late 90s, Buick had enough and pulled the plug on the Skylark. It was clear the car wasn't resonating with buyers, and GM was struggling to make exciting sedans at the time. Today, the Skylark is mostly forgotten, rarely seen on the road, and remembered only as another bland 90s attempt to keep Buick relevant. While the Skylark failed to be an exciting Buick, the Kizashi was a great car that never had a real chance to succeed. Ranked at number 9 is Suzuki Kizashi 2010-2013. The Suzuki Kizashi was actually a well-built car, but that didn't save it from being a massive sales failure. It was supposed to be Suzuki's breakthrough in the mid-size sedan segment. Unfortunately, a 2.4-liter four-cylinder with just 180 horsepower didn't give it much of a performance edge. The interior was surprisingly upscale for a Suzuki, but that wasn't enough. Most buyers didn't even know the Kizashi existed, and Suzuki's small dealership network made it hard to find one. Worse yet, the brand was already struggling in the US, and by 2013, Suzuki abandoned the American market completely. With no dealerships left for support, the Kizashi quickly became an orphaned car. Today, it's an oddball rarity, well-made but doomed by poor marketing and Suzuki's exit from the US market. On the other hand, Pontiac's Grand Am sold well, despite being plagued by cheap materials and reliability issues. Taking the 8th spot is Pontiac Grand Am, 1999 to 2005. The Pontiac Grand Am looked sporty, but that was just a trick. Underneath, it was a cheaply built sedan with a rough 3.4-liter V6 that sounded like a blender full of rocks. The base four-cylinder wasn't much better, making the driving experience underwhelming at best. Inside, Pontiac went for a futuristic look, but the result was a mess. The interior was full of hard plastic, and those weird ribbed door panels looked straight out of a bad sci-fi movie. On top of that, the Grand Am was plagued by reliability issues. Electrical problems, peeling paint, and transmission failures were all common complaints. Pontiac eventually replaced it with the G6, but by then, the brand's reputation had already taken a hit. Today, the Grand Am is mostly remembered for its aggressive styling, but under the surface, it was just another GM sedan that failed to deliver. The Grand Am tried to look sporty but wasn't, while the Volkswagen Phaeton tried to be a luxury car but couldn't escape its VW badge. At number 7, we find Volkswagen Phaeton 2004 to 2006 US market. Volkswagen had a bold idea: sell a $70,000 luxury sedan in the US. The problem? Nobody wanted a Volkswagen at that price. Enter the Phaeton, a beautifully engineered car that flopped hard. Sure, it had a powerful W12 engine, a sophisticated air suspension, and a lavish interior. But at the end of the day, it still wore a VW badge. Buyers who could afford this price range went for Mercedes, BMW, or Audi instead, leaving Phaetons to gather dust in dealerships. Volkswagen quickly realized their mistake and pulled it from the US market after just 2 years. While it found more success in Europe, in America, it remains one of the most spectacular automotive flops of all time. Today, it's a curiosity, an ultra-luxurious Volkswagen that never found its audience. Volkswagen overestimated its brand appeal with the Phaeton, while Chrysler just underestimated how bad the early 200 was. Holding the 6th position is Chrysler 200, 2011 to 2014 pre-refresh models. The Chrysler 200 got better after its 2015 redesign, but the early models were a disaster. The base 2.4-liter four-cylinder was weak, the ride was unrefined, and the interior was stuffed with cheap plastic. The biggest issue? The transmission. It was jerky, slow to respond, and prone to failure, making an already underwhelming car even worse. Even Chrysler's own CEO admitted the early 200 wasn't competitive, and it quickly became a joke among rental fleets. By 2015, Chrysler tried to fix things with a complete redesign, but the damage had already been done. The 200 never fully recovered, and by 2017, Chrysler discontinued it entirely. Today, the pre-refreshed Chrysler 200 is mostly remembered as one of the weakest entries in the mid-size sedan segment, a car that never really stood a chance. The Chrysler 200 was flawed, but at least had some identity, whereas the Mercury Milan was just a slightly different Ford Fusion that no one asked for. In the top 5, at number 5, we have Mercury Milan, 2006-2010. The Mercury Milan wasn't a bad car, it just didn't need to exist. It was a rebadged Ford Fusion with a different grille, a few trim changes, and Mercury badging. The problem? Nobody cared about Mercury anymore. Performance was average, with a choice of a 4-cylinder or a V6, both of which were fine but unremarkable. The interior was comfortable but nothing special, and the styling was completely forgettable. The biggest issue was Mercury itself. The brand was fading fast, and Milan did nothing to revive it. By 2010, Ford shut down Mercury for good, and the Milan disappeared with it. Today, it's just another forgotten badge-engineered sedan, a car that never had a real reason to exist in the first place. And if Mercury struggled with brand recognition, Eagle had even bigger problems. Most people didn't even know it existed. At number 4, we see Eagle Premier, 1988 to 1992. The Eagle Premier was Chrysler's attempt at a full-size sedan with European influences, but it never caught on. Developed in partnership with Renault, it had a smooth ride and decent interior space, but that's where the positives ended. The styling was generic, and the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder was underpowered, making it sluggish off the line. The optional V6 was better, but reliability issues plagued the car. Electrical failures, transmission breakdowns, and poor quality materials made ownership a headache. Chrysler didn't put much effort into marketing the Premier, and as a result, sales were weak. By the late 90s, the entire Eagle brand disappeared, and the Premier became a distant memory. Today, if you ever see one, it's either sitting in a junkyard or being driven by someone who refuses to let go. Like the Premier, the Chevrolet Celebrity was a mid-sized sedan that got by on fleet sales rather than actual demand. Coming in at number 3 is Chevrolet Celebrity, 1982 to 1990. The Chevrolet Celebrity was GM's idea of a practical front-wheel drive mid-size sedan, and while it sold well early on, it aged terribly. By the late 80s, the Celebrity was outdated compared to its competition, with a dull design, weak engines, and uninspiring handling. The 2.8-liter V6 was passable, but the 4-cylinder versions felt gutless. Transmission issues were common, and the interior materials didn't hold up well over time. Fleet sales kept the Celebrity on the road for a while, but by the time GM replaced it with the Lumina, few people cared. Today, it's mostly forgotten, a relic of GM's boxy 80s designs that nobody really misses. At least the Celebrity had a defined market, whereas the Isuzu Axiom seemed to have no idea what it was supposed to be. The runner-up at number 2 is Isuzu Axiom, 2002 to 2004. Isuzu isn't known for sedans, and the Axiom proved why. It was supposed to be a futuristic take on a mid-size crossover, but it was too weird for most buyers. The styling was odd, and while the 3.5-liter V6 had potential, Isuzu's poor engineering got in the way. Transmission failures, electrical problems, and cheap interior materials plagued the Axiom. It was also overpriced for what it offered, and Isuzu's struggling dealer network didn't help. By 2004, Isuzu gave up on selling cars in the US altogether. Today, the Axiom is little more than a footnote in automotive history, mostly remembered for its unusual looks and Isuzu's failed attempt to compete in the SUV-heavy American market. Finally, if the Axiom represented a failed brand on its way out, the Saturn Ion was proof that even GM's attempt at innovation could go completely wrong. Finally, taking the number 1 spot is Saturn Ion, 2003 to 2007. Saturn had big plans for the Ion, but it ended up being one of the company's biggest missteps. The exterior design was quirky, but not in a good way, and the interior was even worse. The center-mounted instrument cluster was awkward, and the cheap materials made the whole cabin feel like an afterthought. The base 2.2-liter engine was noisy and unrefined, and the optional continuously variable transmission was a disaster, prone to failure. Even the sportier Redline version couldn't save the Ion's reputation. By 2007, Saturn replaced the Ion with a much-improved Astra, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and Saturn itself wouldn't survive much longer. Today, the Ion is mostly remembered as a forgettable compact that failed to deliver on its promises. And there you had it, the 40 worst cars that people actively avoid like a red flag on wheels. Now, we gotta ask, which one do you think is the worst of the worst? Drop a comment below. And hey, if you made it this far, chances are you like what we do. A simple click on that subscribe button helps us keep making videos just like this, so why not? It's free, and trust me, it means way more than you think. See you in the next one.